unlike what people normally say, they say, oh, what's the main instrument of Africa? It's the drum. It's not, it's the voice. Certainly in Southern Africa, everyone sings. You don't need an instrument. You don't actually need a drum. You sing as part of your world, as part of how you live. So you sing both to celebrate, you sing to mourn, you sing to feel love for someone. And it's very communal. And there's no such thing as sort of performance. This is in traditional African music. There's not such a strong sense of a performance where you separate yourself from the audience. Well, I grew up, my more young adult life in the 80s, going into the 90s was a very difficult time. It was really a very strong resistance to apartheid, which was becoming even more tightened and more controlling by the state government. And one of the ways of protest was through singing. Often the singing would happen at a funeral where maybe a comrade had been, a comrade's life had been lost as a result of apartheid killings and detentions and all of those things that went on. And the song became a real expression of protest. And then marches and processions, which are very much also part of that time. And I did experience that. I attended some of these events, so I was very aware of, again, the power of the human voice in the context of resistance in terms of what was happening at the time. And there was a lot of separation, and separation was both physical, but even you can think about the separation of sound and what you could listen to, what you couldn't listen to, what you heard and what you didn't, what you could read, what was banned. So in some senses, worlds were quite separate. And then if you add the complication of the cultural boycott that most of the world then used and isolated South Africa because of its apartheid policies and its racist government, you then were really isolated to some extent. And the effect of that, perhaps in some ways, is that you look within yourself and look within what's around you. I was less aware of the pressures of perhaps of the avant-garde movement in Europe certainly when I was working late 70s and early 80s, growing up and listening to music, serialism, electronic music, all of those schools were perhaps not as strongly pushed into the world of certainly for my world, you felt quite removed from that. So perhaps that frees you from the pressures of coming from a particular school. What to then think about African music? Well, African music growing up was kept as something exotic. So I remember as a child being taken in Johannesburg to the mine dancing Sunday performances that in fact were really organized by the mine owners as a way of showing the happy mine workers living under very harsh conditions, but they can sing and dance and play marimba. So this is firstly a kind of apartheid experience of perhaps of African music, but much later I discovered through both my own pushing myself out of perhaps the comfort of sort of suburban white suburbia and moving to Johannesburg, and in fact going back to your question about me being a lawyer, working as a lawyer also in areas that perhaps and working that were the townships of Johannesburg. I worked often in Soweto and went to courts there, but suddenly your ears expanded as well as just your eyes I started to listen to a lot of music that was so-called African music, but it perhaps would be the sound of a church choir, a traditional church choir, or perhaps it was, a lullaby from a person who was singing to a child where I was sitting down somewhere. So it changed for me, and yes, African music has influenced me, but not in the sense that I have gone to formally study African traditional music, but it is very much part of my musical language. Well, certainly artistically, and this has been part of the learning experience for working with William, is that I've learned to trust in not having all the answers for what I make straight away. Some composers, of course, have a set form. You're taught perhaps in the most conventional ways of musical formal composition that you should have a form, you should have a structure to your work. I allow that to unfold. There is a structure eventually, but it comes later. So firstly, I believe in uncertainty and in chance, but not necessarily quite in the way perhaps Cage would work with I Ching, or it's not purely what you would call aleatoric in that you throw it down on the floor and you see where it lands. There's a thought process before, and then you do leave some uncertainty in the making process, but it's not purely a chance thing. In relation to politics, well, of course, nothing is certain in any particular. I don't believe at the moment there's much certainty anywhere in the world, that everything's very unstable. I like uncertainty, perhaps, to go back to the artistic question of artistic. I like the instability sometimes of uncertainty. It can create great artistic tension to bring something interesting. So the uncertainty of taking, perhaps, working with one of my long-time collaborators, Bam Tabeni, who is a singer-songwriter who has not studied music formally, has taking his incredible way of working through improvisation, through just listening through the ear, and putting with a very trained, perhaps contemporary singer who's been to study contemporary music, has been able to read a score very brilliantly, and is very attached to allowing those two people to come together, those two artists, performers, and seeing what happens. That uncertainty creates instability, creates a kind of tension, but something that often can be very exciting and productive.